Hello guys, so welcome back to another tutorial and the third part of our story animation for the Rockfeller video. What we're going to do today is we're going to look at our third slate, which is about introducing the Pennsylvania Railroad Company and having Rockfeller and Thomas Scott head to head. So the thing we're going to do in this one is we're going to do 3D cameras. That is going to be the principle that we're using predominantly in this video. So let's jump in, let's set up our camera rig. So we're going to right click, we're going to go create new camera. New camera, we're going to go for a 35mm because that is pretty standard. Great, and just to show you how this 3D camera rig is going to work, I'm going to make a new solid. I'm going to make it blue, Command Y, Command Y. I've made myself a blue solid, and then Command Y again. I'm going to make myself a red solid. Perfect. Great. I'm going to make these both 3D layers, and I'm going to rotate my red solid by 90 degrees on the x-axis. Yeah, so I've rotated it by 90 degrees on the x-axis. So now we have a bottom layer and we have a layer kind of going perpendicular to it. So we have, I guess, what would be a 3D scene, and we can kind of manipulate it with our camera layer. If we go to the position of our camera, if we go for a keyframe, and if we just move around a little bit, then as you see, we have a camera moving through a 3D plane. As you can see, as I mess around with my X and Y position values, the camera doesn't quite respond in the way that you'd expect a camera to respond. That's because the point of interest of the camera is never changing. You're only changing the position. So if I was to move the camera, say, as if we're looking at this microphone, if I was to move the camera left or right, that is what a traditional camera dolly or track movement would look like. But since the point of interest isn't moving, we're doing this. We're actually panning around, orbiting around our subject. So this isn't quite how we really want to work with our camera layer. So I'm going to make a camera rig that is going to help us manipulate our camera a little bit easier. Set our camera layer. Now I'm going to make a new null object and I call it camera control. I'm going to right click and I'm going to add an effect. Right click, go to expression controls and get a slider control. Lovely. And I'm going to rename that. I'm going to call that X control. Perfect. Perfect. I'm going to duplicate that 2 times. One that's going to be our Y control and one that's going to be our Z control. Lovely. And now let's alt click on the position of our camera layer and let's go open brackets, and we're going to go 960, 540, minus 1866.7. which is just kind of unifying our expression with the current position of the camera, because we don't want to, we're essentially zeroing our camera here. Cool. And now I'm going to go back to my 960. I'm going to press plus. I'm going to grab my pick whip tool, and I'm going to go over to the X control effect that I've just made on my slider. I'm going to go over to my Y. I'm going to go plus. I'm going to go to my pick whip, go to my Y controller. And then I'm going to go to my minus 1866.7, press plus, slider control, and close bracket, and done. So now, as you can see, this null layer now has complete control of my camera. So I don't have to be going into my camera values all the time. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to copy the expression I use on the camera's position and paste it onto my point of interest of my camera. Now, as you see, if we mess around with our X, Y, and Z controls, we have the camera panning, right, left, forward, back, and up, down as well. And now all we need to do is to do some pan arounds or orbit effects. We just have to manipulate the rotation. But what we're going to do, just to make sure that all the camera's effects are on our control layer, we're going to right click on our camera control layer. We're going to go new expression control effect, and we're going to go angle control. I'm going to rename this pitch, camera pitch. Duplicate that twice. We'll call the next one roll, and we'll call the last quality yaw, which essentially is just pitches up and down. Roll is kind of the Z rotation of the camera. Yaw is the horizontal angle of the camera. So just as we have before, I'm going to right click on camera rotation, and I'm going to parent straight away. I'm going to just go to X rotation. I'm going to alt click. I'm going to grab that pick whip and bring it over to my pitch quality on my camera control. I'm going to do the same with my Y rotation, which is going to go to my yaw. And then I'm going to go to my Z rotation. I'm going to alt click it, pick whip it to my roll. So there we go. So now we have a layer which is basically controlling all the values of the camera. We don't have to worry about jumping into the nitty gritty of all the expressions or anything, or any of the qualities that are within the camera layer. Now we can quite easily manipulate our camera in space. Fantastic. Nice. I'll throw a few keyframes in there just to see, just so you guys can see what we're dealing with, and just to show how this camera works in practice. So there you go. So now our camera pans from a front-on perspective to a 90-degree perspective. There we go. Our camera does a little orbit around our solids. That's our camera rig now set up. I'm going to start constructing my scene for scene 3. So looking at our information that we've written down, our ideas, we've got intro to the Pennsylvania Railroad Company, front-on shot of a train approaching, and then we've got Rockfeller above the railroad company, all powerful. So in my head, I'm going to have a train approaching the camera. I'm going to have the camera pan up just to show Rockfeller in the sky. So that's a nice simple kind of scene to set up. So I found myself a train layer. Make sure we upscale those images as well using our AI software IMG scaler. I'm going to take it into Photoshop and I'm going to cut it out as usual, and I'm just going to tune up that layer mask just to make sure that it's nice and clean. I'll drag my train layer in, I'll drag an image of Rockfeller, and I'll make them 3D layers just so I can control everything with the 3D camera. And it always helps, guys, just to shy some of your layers that you're not using. For instance, Screen 4, Tom Scott, all these text layers that I did within Premiere, the Chapter 5 WAV, I don't really need to see that. It's just clutter in my composition. And you might even be able to shy your camera layer for now, just until later, as later we're going to want to adjust some of the depth of field and the focal distance qualities of the camera. But for now, while we're doing more broad strokes on our composition, let's press our little friend here with the long nose, and let's start shining some layers so we can keep our composition nice and clean, please. So there we go. So we've got Rockfeller in position, we've got a train in position. I'm going to start messing around with the keyframes of these layers just so I can get an idea of what exactly I'm going to be doing here. I'm going to keyframe the position of my train and the scale of my train. I'm going to want to make it look like the train is coming towards me. I'm moving through space, so I'm going to want to just move the train from the middle of my composition ever so slightly to the left of my composition and up the scale so it looks like it's traveling towards me. So let's see what that looks like. And I'll put Rockfeller just behind the train as well. If I do a little camera movement as well, a little pan out, that's already looking pretty good. So we can see how our scene is gonna start getting set up now, just with these very basic movements. I think I'm gonna have the train traveling at night because that will make it a little bit moody. Cool. I've got this sky. That's kind of more like at dusk or sunset. But I might change the colors just to make it look a little bit more nighttime. But let's just start by getting it in position. Let's put it behind Rockfeller, and let's make it a 3D layer as well, of course. Cool. I'm going to drag my train track layer that I created in the last video in the top-down shot, and make that a 3D layer. And as before, I'm going to mess around with the rotation just to put it into position, so it's flat along the floor for the train to pass over. Mess around with the rotation, the scale, just so it's nicely positioned. That's good. Now I just need to mess around with the scale a little bit. Cool. And right away, as soon as we put our 3D track in position, it actually looks like our train is moving along that 3D train track. So that's looking good. I'm happy with that. I don't like these bushes out of the side, so I think I'm going to mask those out, feather that out, and I'll replace them with something else. I'll get an asset from the old interweb. Lovely. I know I'm going to want to add some hills maybe and like some background information just to kind of make this feel a little bit fuller. So I've got some hills from Unsplash. I have cut them out within Photoshop and I'm going to drag them into After Effects. Cool. And it's just, again, it's just about placing your background information just around the scene within 3D space to really bring your scene alive. So I've got two hills. I'm going to copy and paste those. I'm going to duplicate and I see where we're at so far. So straight away, you can see how this composition is coming together. Our friend Rockfeller is in the background. He's looking over the Pennsylvania Railroad, and we look up and then boom, there he is. Let's move on. Let's have a little look at maybe add in a sun. Maybe a sun could be quite cool. Gives us something to flare on the image. So let's get a few variations of suns. So we got some stuff to mess around with. Let's import them into our friend After Effects. Cool. Let's make that sun a 3D layer and place it where we want it. And that's looking pretty good to me. That looks pretty ominous. Lovely. I'm adding a little bit of a wiggle to the camera movement now. Just because that'll bring it to life a little bit. So I'm alt clicking on my expression control, my X and Y, and I'm going wiggle to 5. Fantastic. I'll just give it kind of that little jittery quality that we like so much. Now let's get as you can see, it looks like our train track is kind of flying above these hills. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag some detail in there. I'm now going to go into my train pre-comp. I'm going to add some smoke. That's going to be billowing out the top of the train, just like we did in the last one. Because it's a slightly longer composition, you are going to have to duplicate the smoke effect. And I'm just doing that with a little fade. Copy and paste in that. And just making sure the smoke takes up the whole duration. Okay, lovely. That's starting to come together. Lovely. Right, now I'm going to add a bit more background information. As I say, it's all about just adding as much kind of detail to the shots as possible. The more you put in there, the more it feels 3D and the more authentic and visually pleasing the animation will be to your audience. So now, guys, I'm going to add a city to the background just to add a little bit more depth. I've got this old image of a city that I'm just going to, I've dragged into my composition. I pre-composed it, so it's fully editable in the pre-comp. Now I notice that obviously I've got a sky in the image, which doesn't really do me any favors. So I'm just going to go within that pre-comp and I'm just going to mask around the city. It's a little bit of a laborious task, but on this occasion, I think it's probably necessary. Mask around that city, and then boom, mess around with the Y position in the top comp, and then just the X position as well, and then yeah, there we go, we've got a bit of background information, so I'm happy with that. Lovely, that's coming together. We're going to go to our camera layer now, so unshy your camera layer, and now we're going to start messing around with the depth of field, because this is really where the image is going to start to get tied together. It's going to make it feel much more authentic. So I'm going to turn on my depth of field. I'm going to up my aperture to like, I don't know, 700. I might tweak it a little bit later. The higher it is, the more blurry your background will be. So let's mess around with the focal distance. We'll keyframe that. And if we look at our top layer, our top view of the composition, we'll be able to see what is in focus. You can see our train layer is this line here. So we just need to make sure that our focal distance is on top of that train layer, so it's nice and sharp. Perfect. And we just need to keyframe it to match the movement of the camera. And then facing up, we're going to see Rockfeller, and this is where we're going to throw our focus all the way to the background so we reveal Rockfeller. Lovely. Nice. You'll notice because our train isn't actually a 3D layer, we're actually looking at a 2D layer put in 3D space, that there's no drop off where the train gets further back, like where the carriages are. So I'm going to simulate that, otherwise it will look a little bit out of place. So I'm going to go to Gaussian blur, drag that on my old train comp. I'm going to whack up the blurriness. Don't worry, it's going to look a bit crazy now, but don't worry, we'll fix it all up. So I'm going to get my mask layer. I'm going to turn it to an ellipse. I'm going to mask around my train layer, and then I'm going to go to my effects tab, go to Gaussian blur, and see where it says plus and minus, the compositing option. I'm going to plus, and I grab my mask, and it should just be on the default mask 1. I'm going to invert the mask now. As you can see, now my effect is honoring the mask that I created on top of the layer. So I'm just going to expand my mask so to reveal what I want revealed and to have everything that's outside of the shape to be blurry, and then I'm just going to feather it a little bit so it looks like a natural drop off. There we go. So that is how to simulate our depth of field. And I don't really like that I can see Rockfeller the whole time in the background. It looks a bit naff. So what I'm going to do is have him fade up. I'm going to go to my opacity, press T, or just go to my drop down menu. I'm going to find where the camera pans up, and I'm going to bring the opacity of Rockfeller down from, start it at 0% and then bring it up to 100% as the camera gets into position. So let's have a little look what that looks like. Lovely. And as you can see, the smoke is a little bit of the train is a little bit distracting as the camera pans up. So I'm going to do the reverse of what I've done with Rockfeller at this point. So as the camera pans up, I'm going to have the opacity of the old train go from 100 down to 0. So it sort of disappears. Great. Lovely. So that is the start to what is going to be the next part of the slate. Now just nudging the camera and the elements in around just so they all take up the appropriate amount of space. And if things don't, if you start to see borders on your composition or like kind of the edges of assets you're using, that's fine. We can go through and start tweaking that, expand our compositions a little bit, or use the CC reptile tool just to expand the borders so we don't see any of those nasty lines. I think I want to add some more foreground information because as I say, the more foreground information we can add to the video, the better it is going to look. So I'm going to go through to Unsplash and I'm going to find a couple of trees, and I think if I put them just to the side of the train track and kind of have the camera pass through, like it'll look like there's it'll look like the camera's kind of passing through some trees and have the train obviously traveling towards the camera. I think that'll be quite a nice effect, and I think it will really help sell what I'm doing here. So I'm going to go to Unsplash. I'm going to download a bunch of images of trees, and I'm probably going to bring them into Photoshop and cut them out. Trees can be a little bit tough because obviously the lines are so blurred. It's not like a hard edge between sky and leaf. It's kind of like speckled. So Photoshop may not do an amazing job, but it doesn't need to be perfect. I just go through and kind of tweak it in places if needs be. And then when you go into After Effects, we can kind of manipulate it a little bit more just to kind of help sell the effect. So I've got myself a few variations of some trees. I'm going to bring these into After Effects. Now that you're in After Effects, you might start to see that the cutouts need a little bit more work. So just to kind of help the cutout, just to kind of clean up the layer mask that you did in Photoshop, I'm going to add a luma key. I'm going to pick out the blue sky and I'm going to add a choker just to kind of like clean up those edges a bit. Again, they don't need to look perfect because this is an animation. It's going to look a little bit stylish. Just the more we can do to kind of like just make it a little bit better, that'd be good. You could also experiment with a luma key rather than a color key because that might be more appropriate depending on the image that you've got. So now it's a matter of just dotting these trees in 3D space like we've been doing with all of our other assets. So we've now got our tree pre-comps and we're just going to knock them around the image, just kind of spread them out. Having some nice and close to the camera will also help. Gives it a little bit of extra depth. And there we go, that's looking really nice. And it's also kind of sorting out the angle problem we have at the back of the carriages. So we track out along the trees, we pan up, boom, there's Rockfeller. Smashing, love that. And I actually quite like that you can still see the tips of the trees. It kind of like frames Rockfeller a little bit better. So maybe add a few more, just to kind of sell it a bit more. Sell the effect. Looking up. Now I need to use the opacity feature on the trees just to keyframe them out as the camera pulls back into the second half of our Slate 3 composition. And I know I'm going to want to reveal Tom Scott at this point because obviously we're talking about him. So I'm going to get myself an image of Tom Scott, save that image, upscale that image and bring it into Photoshop like we always do. Let's bring him into our top composition. Let's make him 3D. And right away, our Tom Scott is going to jump right to the back of the composition, but that's fine. Let's just move him around as to where we want him to be in 3D space. And I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to have him right at the front of the composition. So we have Rockfeller in the background, we've got the hills, which are going to have pipeline on them, and then we're going to have Tom Scott right at the front. So it's almost kind of like they're facing off. Lovely, let's nudge him into space. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in some of my drills that I made in the last composition. As you can see, it's always good to be recycling your assets because you spend so long making them, you might as well get as much bang for your buck as you possibly can. So I'm going to bring in my drills, I'm going to spread them in 3D space, just kind of fill up the scene a little bit. Lovely, bring one to the front, lovely like that. So I'm going to now make a pipeline and I'm going to have that kind of animate because I think I'm going to use a shape layer to simulate the idea of a pipeline kind of weaving its way over the hills, thus representing that Thomas Scott is building pipelines of all things. So let's use a shape layer to do that. I'm going to use a path with a stroke. I'm going to get weaving amongst the hills and I'm going to taper the edge down a little bit just so it looks like it's got perspective. Make it a 3D layer, nudge it back into position. It looks like it's coming together. So we got that line kind of appearing over the hill. We use a trim path to kind of have it animate on. Maybe play around with the coloring a little bit. Better yet, what I'll do is I'll bring in a metal solid and I use that I use the pipeline as an alpha matte to kind of give the pipeline a metallic texture rather than just be a white line. So that will work for me. So let's have a quick look at what we're dealing with. So we've got the train panning through, panning along the tracks, and then we pitch up. We see Rockfeller, he's livid. We pull out, we see Thomas Scott, he's building pipelines, cracking. Cool, so add in a little bit more detail into the shot. I'm going to add a cooling tower from what looks like a nuclear power plant, make a new composition with it. And I'm going to add in a smoke layer as well, just to look like smoke's billowing out the top of it. Drag that into my top comp, my chapter 5, slate 3, and as before, I'm just going to move it in position to where I like it, and I'll move it just behind the back hill. Cool, so we've now done the fundamentals of our scene. It's now just a matter of kind of tying it all together. Like, it's all looking really good. I'm really happy with it. So I'm going to go into my train composition, and I'm going to add a little bit of kind of a jiggle, as the train kind of like goes over bumps and stuff. That'll be nice and easy to do. I'll go into my train composition. I'm going to go onto my train layer. And I'm going to go to the Y position. I'm going to separate dimensions. I'm going to go wiggle, and I'm going to make it, say, I don't know, 2, 5 or something like that. There we go. It looks like my train is kind of bumping along the tracks. Maybe I'll tweak it a little bit just to see what I like. So maybe 4, 5. There we go. That looks looking all right. Looking all right. So now we've got a little bit of movement on the train. Great. I think I can add a fog light into the shot as well, because that might be cool to have, like in the last composition, to have some flaring coming off of the front of the train. So I've got this fog light, and I'm just going to cut that out, put it at the front of my train. I'm going to add what's called a volumetric light path. Essentially, you know, when you see in films, say in a dusty environment, or you know, or misty environments, when you shine a light through those environments, the light kind of hits the particles in the air. You see what you think is kind of like, it looks like the light kind of like taking shape in the air. So that's usually synonymous with a very cinematic look. So I think that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to create one of these. So to do so within this composition, I'm going to have to expand my composition of my train just to give myself a little bit of room to work with. So I'm going to press Command K. I'm just going to kind of increase how many pixels is on the X and Y. And I'm going to press Command Y, and I'm going to make a solid, and I'm going to make it like yellow or something like that. And I'm just going to do a rudimentary mask where the light leak, I want the light leak to be. Lovely, just kind of shape that up. Maybe add some feather into the mask and mess around with the opacity. Maybe harder feather in at the front of the light. Lovely. If we go back to our top comp and see how that's doing, it's looking pretty good. It's looking pretty good. Obviously, it's caught behind a tree, which is not what we want. So maybe what I'll do is I'll take the light ray and I'll bring it straight into our top comp, because otherwise we're going to have an issue with layering, because the light leak will be technically behind the trees, but we'll want the trees to look like they're in front of the light leak. So that can be a little bit challenging. So let's grab our medium yellow solid from our train comp and let's bring it into our main comp. Let's bring it to the front of the composition, probably further in front of our train. And let's just nudge it into position. There we go. We're already cooking with fire there. That looks really good. It looks like a nice little kind of lens flare coming off of the train. So let's just nudge around that mask a little bit just to make sure we're happy with everything. I'll change the feathering a little bit because it looks a little bit too feathered now that we've got it in the top. I'm going to go back into my train layer and just kind of nudge around my fog light a little bit just because it doesn't look amazing. I'm going to add a brightness and contrast effect to my medium yellow solid, or my volumetric light rays. I'm just going to make it look like the light is flickering a little bit. I'm going to alt click the brightness, and I'm going to try 530, so 5 times a second and 30 on the brightness effect. Let's have a look what that is looking like. Lovely, pretty happy with that. I'm going to go back into our train comp, and I've noticed our fog light isn't actually bobbing up and down with our train, so let's just parent our fog light to our train layer. Now, just to make our light leak layer look even that more dazzling, we're going to duplicate it. We're going to duplicate our medium yellow solid, and we're going to make it more of an oval shape, just so it's kind of a general kind of flare around the fog light instead of just the volumetric look. And we'll just kind of bring that around our fog light. Remember to make sure your blending mode is set to screen on the fog light as well, because that is quite fundamental to the effect. So there we go. And you could duplicate it again and mess around with other blending modes just to kind of sell that a light leak a little bit more, but it's not always necessary, so I'll probably just stick with the 2. Actually, maybe I will make a 3rd light leak layer. I'm also going to keyframe out the light leaks as the camera pans up, because again, they're distracting. We're going to have go to opacity on all these layers, and we're just going to keyframe them down. Great, so now we've got our light leak in place. I'm happy with that. I think that looks really good. I'm now going to go to my Rockfeller background image, because he's a bit static at the minute, and I do think it would be beneficial to kind of give him some movement. So let's double click our friend Rockfeller, the pre-composition. Let's go into his pre-comp, and we're going to use something called a puppet pin now, because it's probably the most efficient way of doing an animation like this. So a puppet pin is essentially you're telling After Effects to distort or squish or stretch a particular image, but you're telling it whereabouts the joints are. So if I was to say have this image of Rockfeller and put a pin in his head and put a pin on his chest, then I can distort just the head whilst keeping the chest in position for the most part. So we usually put pins on joints where we want to have where we don't want to stretch the image. So in this case, I'm going to have Rockfeller looking down, then looking up, and that will be quite easy to do with the puppet pin effect. So let's have a quick look. So I'll make a pin in his head and then a pin in his neck, and I'll also put one right down the bottom towards his hip, just so we can kind of root the whole image down. Otherwise we'll start to see some warping around the edges. And I go to my mesh, I go to deform, and I go to open up all my puppet pins and make sure that the keyframe is, I'm keyframing all of them. Great. And then just move the head into the position I want it. We're going to ease on those keyframes And let's see what we're dealing with. There we go. So we've got a little bit of movement with Rockfeller. So he's just kind of like looking. He's going from looking down, being lent down, to looking up. It's a basic effect. It's a basic way to do character animations. But given everything else that's going on in this image, I think that's fine. Great. And I might even add some contrast to his layer as well, just to make it a little bit more menacing. So go to curves, drop that onto the Rockfeller layer, and just kind of like make it a little bit darker. Great. I'm now going to add a little bit of extra life to the train and to the scene using some assets that I got from Storyblock. I'm going to add some mist and some atmosphere. So let's start with that one. Just make sure that it's set to a blended mode of screen. Put that in 3D space, put it at the front. And that's nice, that is, because that really complements the volumetric light that we're looking at. So it almost feels like the light, we can see the volumetric light because we are seeing it through the mist in the scene. So great, I love that. We could duplicate that and put it in a few places on the composition, but I'm not sure if we need that. I think we can just put it the once, make sure it's scaled so we're not seeing any of those nasty edges. Now we're looking at a scene that's quite misty, and as I said at the beginning, I was hoping to make the scene a little bit darker to begin with. So let's do that. So let's go to our background layer where where we've pre-composed the sun and the clouds and everything, where it looks all quite warm and kind of sunset. And let's mess around with hue, saturation, and let's mess around with the brightness. Cool. So let's keyframe the hue and saturation. Let's click colorize, and let's keyframe the colorize hue. And let's start with the background looking nice blue and dark and ominous, kind of very stormy. So then it will look like it's at night. And then once we get up to Rockfeller, we'll make the sky nice and warm again. Mess around with the lightness as well. And mess around with the saturation as well. So I'm going to add a little explosion around Rockfeller as we look up to him and see his face, because that's dramatic. So let's get our fireball effect from Storyblocks, and let's just pop that just behind Rockfeller. I don't think that one needs to be a 3D layer. That can probably just go straight behind him, because there's not going to be much parallax in the time that the explosion is there. Another little detail I'm going to add is some kind of kind of particle, kind of fiery, kind of like a particle-y looks, almost like fireflies in the air. I'll probably make them a 3D layer. These are ones that I've got from Storyblocks. They're just kind of like little embers kind of flying around, and they're kind of that help add a little bit of extra dimension to the scene. Let's move that around in 3D space as always. Could even duplicate this layer, so we've got I've got a bit of depth of them all over the place. Lovely. Happy with that. Rockfeller looking down on us. Might even add some sparks to the train wheels, because train wheels spark, and that will again help sell the effect. I hope you're seeing, guys, that really to make these effects work, it really is about the little details. Like, you have fundamental tools and stuff that you can learn within After Effects, and hopefully we've taught you over the last few weeks, but fundamentally, like, it is just about adding tiny little details, tiny gestures that will really help make your animations pop. So let's get our glowing ember. Let's put that down to the wheels on our train. Let's move it in 3D space as well, and make it a 3D layer, because those will have to move with our camera. Make sure you have the correct blender mode, make it screen. Lovely. And it looks like the train wheels are spitting out some sparks. Lovely. And just like we did with Rockfeller, I'm now going to animate Tom Scott. I'm going to add some puppet pins to him, to his shoulders, to his waist, and to his head, and make it look like he's looking down and then looking up. Again, just about adding these nice little animations, just kind of bring everything alive. And just to tie everything together, now we're on the second half of Slate 3. I think I'm going down the opacity of the background as we get to Thomas Scott, because I want him to be the focus, so it's almost like everything else is background information. And I'm going to add some flames to the background as well that I got from Storyblocks, again just to make everything look dramatic. So I'm going to get a black solid. I'm just going to get that to fade in over the top of the second half of the slate, just as I get to Tom Scott, and I'll get the fire to fade in as well. No need to make these 3D layers. They're more like overlays than they are actually scene information. So let's have a look at what we're dealing with. So how are we doing? Start with train, pan up, boom. We have a Rockfeller, zoom out, smashing. There we go, Tom Scott in all his glory. In all his bloody glory. And I think I'm pretty happy with that. I think that's looking really good. I'm now going to add some kind of like overall effects like we do in all of our animations. I'm going to add a particle effect. I'll add a vignette over the whole thing, just because that'll make it look a little bit more gritty. I'll grab my adjustment layer that we did for our first composition, which has got a posterized time effect on it, and it's got some color grading. I'll drop that on top of our composition as well. It doesn't quite look how I want it to in this particular composition, because we're using different assets than we did in our first composition. So I'm just going to tweak our Lumetri color a little bit, just so it's kind of looks how we want it to look. There we go. Maybe warm up a little bit, up the saturation a touch more, and sort out the tint. Now I'm going to grab our paper texture. I'm going to drag that in as well on top of everything. That's got an overlay opacity mode on it, blending mode on it. And that looks really good. I'm really happy with that. I think that's really come together. That's a really stylish and pretty piece. And then I think there's one more thing that I want to change actually. So if we go to the second half of our slate, I've realized that one, I don't want to have those drills in the shot, because at this point in the narrative, Thomas Scott hasn't made any drills. He's not drilling for anything yet. He's just laying pipeline. So I feel like we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. So I'm just going to make the pipeline more a focus of our of this set design, and I'm going to add a real life pipeline to the front of the image, because at the back of the image, the shape layer is doing an adequate job of simulating pipeline, but as soon as we get to the front, now the pipeline is right at the front of the image, it looks a bit naff. It's clear that it's just a white line. So let's get some real pipeline off the internet and cut it out in Photoshop. This is a tougher one because the pixel count is quite low, but it should be fine for our purposes. Great, cut that out. That's looking nice. Go to our composition with our second half of slate 3. As you can see, I've got rid of our drill layers and I've replaced them with some trees just to kind of make it feel a little bit more, just to fill up the composition a little bit. I'm now going to drop our pipeline in there that we've just cut out, arrange it in 3D space, probably bring it right to the front, There we go, that's looking pretty nice. As you can see, the angle of the pipeline that was in the image isn't the right perspective to what we have in our image, because the hill comes up and then we have lots of hills in the background. So we kind of need the pipeline to kind of arc down along the path of the hill. So I'm going to do this with puppet pins, as we've done before. Let's see that in position. Let's just nudge those puppet pins around, make it look like the pipeline is falling off the edge of the hill. There we go, falling off the edge of the hill. And then I just need to update the path of the shape layer that we have created. I think that means just, yeah, there we go, just moving that line just out of, so it looks like it leads up to the pipeline we've just cut out. And I think I'm gonna pre-compose the pipeline, and in the new layer I'm just gonna have the pipeline kind of like fade, kind of wipe onto the shot, because the shape layer kind of trim paths on, so it kind of draws itself on. So if I like have the pipeline kind of fade from right to left, it will look like a continuation of the trim path that we've done with our shape layer. And there we go. So just do that with a layer mask and a solid, and there we go. Let's see that in shot. Fantastic. So let's have a look at our final composition and see how we did.
The railroad companies were faced with the fact that one of their most important customers was making them obsolete. So Tom Scott, the owner of the Pennsylvania Railroad, decided to lay his own pipelines. But he also did something he knew John wouldn't like.
Okay guys, so that is slate 3 of our story animation done for Rockfeller. Hopefully there's so much information there that you can implement into your own animations. So I will see you guys in the next video, which is slate 4 and is the final slate in our story animation.